Oh, some nice people out there. Hi,
Yeah.
y'all.
Oh, yeah. Hey, everybody. Peter Maravellis here, hoping this finds you all safe and well. On behalf of City Lights booksellers and publishers and the City Lights Foundation, I'd like to welcome you to City Lights Live, our virtual online reading series. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral grounds of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area, from where we continue to celebrate the works of authors we know and love with readings, discussions, and forums moving into the spring season and beyond. So tonight, it is a delight and an honor to welcome back to the house, albeit the virtual one, Barry Gifford. Barry is no stranger to City Lights. We've featured him on numerous occasions as we are great admirers of his work. Many of you, of course, know him best for his collaborations with David Lynch. Barry is responsible for the legendary Wild at Heart and the screenplay for Lost Highway. He is the author of more than 40 works of fiction, nonfiction, screenplays, librettos, you name it. His creative reach extends far. His works have been translated into over 25 languages. His Roy stories are, of course, the crowning achievement, really an amazing work. We just celebrated a wonderful event over the weekend at the Roxy Theater with Barry and filmmaker Rob Christopher, where we screened Roy's World, Barry Gifford's Chicago. It's the film that Rob has directed. It was followed by a lovely talk between Barry and Rob. We were also celebrating the publication of yet another book in the Roy Stories series. It's titled The Boy Who Ran Away to Sea. It's published by Seven Stories Press. So it was a really nice event, but that's actually not why we're here tonight. Coinciding with the publication of The Boy Who Ran Away to Sea is yet another book. What a lot of people don't realize is that Barry is also a very gifted poet, and his poems deserve a much wider attention. So tonight, we celebrate a new collection of poetry. It is titled How Chet Baker Died. It is also published by Seven Stories Press. The work in this collection is at once emotionally tender, mysterious. It's got poignancy, yet just beauty, and the poems possess a kind of a lyrical dimension. And the fact that Chet Baker is prominently featured in the title builds up a field of associations that I think are unique to Barry's work. His reflections on daily life, on love, on music, on friendship, and being present in the moment. So joining Barry tonight will be Michael Ray, also yet another friend of City Lights. Michael is the editor of Zoetrope All Story. He's also a screenwriter whose films have been selected for the Venice Telluride and Toronto Film Festivals, among others. His most recent film, While the Women Are Sleeping, was directed by Wayne Wang and starred Beat Takeshi and premiered in 2016 at the Berlin International Film Festival. I have to add, today is Michael's birthday, so we are also especially appreciative that he took time to join us. I actually mixed cocktails to your honor, and happy birthday.
As can the rest of you, if you'd like.
Yeah, let me let a few people in here because we got some people waiting, stragglers. Okay, so we were going to feature our friend Jim Nisbet. Sadly, Jim is feeling under the weather and could not make it tonight. We wish him well. But, you know, we may have a special visit by a mystery guest who may actually sing us a little song. We'll have to see if they make it in time. So before we begin, I'll remind you that we'll be posting links in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard with which you may purchase copies of Barry's books. We'll also be hosting a little Q&A. If you want to drop in questions, comments, praise, anything in the chat function, please go right ahead. So please join us now in giving a warm welcome to Barry Gifford and Michael Ray. Gentlemen, welcome to the virtual City Lights.
The first thing I want to say is that Peter Marvelous, as I call him, Peter Maravellis, is one of the dedicatees to this book, How Chet Baker Died. It's dedicated to my old friends Jim Harrison and Al Young after the fact, as I wrote, and for Peter Maravellis in the moment. So thank you, Peter, for being so helpful all along the way. And I'm going to read this poem I wrote for Jim Harrison. And it's dedicated to Mary Lou, my wife. Jim Harrison. I miss Jim Harrison, not just his new poems and novels he won't write, his blind, wandering left eye, gargantuan appetite, his generosity. He loved Mary Lou's flowers, sitting in our garden. He'd never been to a racetrack, so I took him, taught him how to read the racing form, how to bet. We both won a little that day. He'd call me after midnight. I could hear the ice clink in his glass of scotch before the gravelly voice. He'd never failed to mention Mary Lou's flowers in letters, on the phone, and when we met. When I was in my 20s, he told me, if you lived in New York, you'd already be a famous poet. Walking on his property near the Arizona-Mexico border, he brushed away a rattlesnake with his cane. I don't shoot snakes anymore, he said, unless I have to, like writing poems. He died 2 years ago. Mary Lou's flowers are beautiful this year, Jim, especially the blue irises. So to me, that, that's what poetry is all about. It's very personal. And before we came on here, we were just talking about the genesis of all this, because in the old days, I was primarily a musician, and I didn't know anything about poetry. And I didn't read it. I didn't really bear any relation to it, but I was writing songs. And I was living in London then. And an editor of a British literary magazine, The Listener, was at my place. And he saw the song lyrics lying everywhere around, the snatches of paper and all that kind of thing. And he said, well, these are really poems. He said, and he showed me how you can break up the lines, and he taught me about the breath, I was talking about William Carlos Williams and Walt Whitman and whomever it was at the time. And he said, look, here's how you do it. Here's where you make the break. Here's where you chop the line. Here's all that sort of stuff. And he was responsible for my first book getting published. So the book, this was 1967, I was just 20. And I didn't really have a second act when it came to poetry. I mean, I looked at this, I said, oh yeah, this is interesting. And people seem to like it well enough. But I remember when the first reading I was scheduled to do was at a place called Better Books in London, which was a very popular, famous bookstore at the time, run by this guy, Bob. I can't remember his last name, but he was a concrete poet, whatever that means or meant. And I'm from Chicago, so concrete means that's what they put you in concrete and, dump you in Lake Michigan. So that's the world I was coming out from. But in any case, I got cold feet. I didn't know how to read in public, that kind of thing. So I said, well, I pretended I had a sore throat. And I said, I can't read the poems. And I gave the book to a friend of mine who was in fact an actor and said, Norman, can you do this for me? Can you please come up and read it? But of course, whenever he came across a French word, I remember he didn't know how to pronounce Rimbaud, so he said Rimbaud. And it was pretty funny. But he did the reading for me. And so doing poetry readings, I've done seldom. But I did learn, to pay attention to what I was doing. And, it was various people who showed me the way. Poets like David Bromwich, Robert Duncan, various others. And what it was foundational about, I didn't mean to be speechifying here, Pete, but since you gave me the floor, it really taught me about economy of language. And I think that's what I incorporated into my fiction, because primarily I'm a fiction writer. And I learned enough about what to leave out. And the more you leave out, the better. And the fact that, it was important to let the reader participate, let the reader fill in the blanks, let the reader use his or her imagination. And, that's what I've been trying to do all along.
Well, I was just thinking, Barry, about, I mean, that sort of musical nature of language, you know, because sometimes we'll get together for lunch and I'll come over to Barry's studio and, you know, a lot of times you'll read something like a piece of fiction that you're working on. And so is that how you sort of consider your work? I mean, reading back through it and listening to it aloud?
I don't know about listening to it aloud.
Like how it sounds.
I suppose that comes from the musical background. Yes, definitely listening to how it sounds. I mean, I've learned from so many people and borrowed from so many people. And once I understood the principle laid down by Proust, which was to say, you know, literature is the finest kind of lying, it was a kind of freedom and a blessing in the sense that I love fiction, because what does it mean? It means you made it up. And, you know, that's just what I've been doing. So it gives you that kind of freedom. So poetry to me is, you know, just the foundation of everything. And as I said, it really taught me about economy, and also eventually by reading the mostly Asian poets, Chinese and Japanese poets, they gave me a different avenue into a sensibility, especially poets like Wang Wei, Li Po, Tu Fu, Su Teng Po. And so from those poets, I think I learned more than from any English language poets. The French poets were better for me because they were more off the wall, like Reverdy. You know, in fact, I think in the book, I have a poem for Reverdy. I don't remember where it is exactly. Gee, I don't know. I don't know what that one is, but I'll read another poem that I wrote for Jim Harrison. It's called Women and Death. And it was in the last letter that I wrote to Jim. These days, my poems are mostly about women and death. In other words, those who are gone. It was Pessoa, among others, who suggested that memories are merely residue of what's best left forgotten. And Lady Pan, victim of slander.
Hey, Michael and Barry, you've frozen up. So I think that maybe the bandwidth over there is a little funky. Yeah, they're obviously having some kind of trouble. Sorry about this, folks. Hey, you guys, are you trying to get on? Yeah.
I don't know what happened, but we're at Michael's house because he just lost the internet.
Oh, his internet went out. Oh, wow. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so very sorry.
Trying to connect right now.
Okay. Okay.
We're connecting by phone now because the power's out in the neighborhood.
Okay. Let's see if we can get the video up. There we go. Oh, you're kind of sideways. It's interesting.
Oh, we're sideways?
No, you're side. Yeah.
Yeah.
Turn it up.
Defying gravity. I
How's
love
that?
it. Ah, there
Now
we
we
go.
got-
That work?
Perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now we, yeah,
Hooray. Okay.
you know, Berkeley is, you know,
Yeah.
anti-poetry.
Yeah.
They wanted to get rid of us. I forget where
Are we back
got-
on now?
Yeah,
Are
you're
we
back on.
online.
All right. So we're now to explain, power just went out in our neighborhood in Berkeley. Now we're connecting by phone. So
Okay, but we can see you, Pete.
we're undeterred.
So
Great.
where did we stop? I don't even remember
were-
what I was out about.
We can start. You can start on read. How about if you read something?
Oh, anyway, well, what I was talking about, as I recall, was the influences and how I began to understand poetry and reading all these different people that I hadn't read before. I'd always been a big reader, but not of poetry. And I wrote a poem called My Book, which Jim Nisbet always liked. So I'll read that. My shelves are full of books by dead men and women. Most of the authors thought they had something important to say about what was going on around them, or only in their own minds. The books contain truths, lies, and every kind of foolish thought, even some not so foolish. What's to be done with them if there no longer are readers? About my own books, the ones I've written, I'm not worried. They're going with me, and a few of the others too. I'll have plenty of room, just as I've always had. So that's, as far as my philosophy goes, that's it. But, one other one that's also important. It was about Robert Duncan. What Bobby D taught me. And I'm assuming that most of you out there know who Robert Duncan was. Robert Duncan was a great poet. His poem, My Mother Was a Falconess, is definitely part of the canon. Bobby D is our friend David Bromwich, also a great poet, used to call him. They're both gone now. I remember Duncan coming out of a bookstore in San Francisco, running down the street.
Uh-oh.
Haste, my dear Patroclus. What's that? I asked. Achilles, calling out from his ship anchored in the harbor to Nestor, on shore in his chariot. The Iliad, dear Barry, which sent me to Homer. So that's how I learned.
I wonder if Peter's offline now.
Peter, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here, but you're very choppy, and for a moment you froze up. So yeah, the connection. I guess it's not just the power; it's also like I guess it's maybe affected the transmitter towers or something. Yeah, because you're a little bit choppy. You're better now, actually. Yeah, now I can see you fine.
Picture is better.
A little bit, yeah. Still a little kind of choppy when you talk.
Well, sorry, those of you who turned in. We'll have to have a second date or something.
Yeah, I was thinking maybe we could reschedule it because it's so choppy and kind of strange. I mean, you're a little bit better now, though.
Well, do you want me to continue? Do you want us to continue or no?
We'll continue for maybe a little bit longer, and let's just see kind of.
Is there a way to do any Q&A if people have questions?
Yeah, I mean, let's just kind of see. I mean, there are a few comments in there already. So we got a bunch of actually some really nice comments here. Somebody says, let's see, patience for poetry. We are all fine and happy to be patient. Somebody else, Dairy Queen says, willing to wait with a smiley face. 316970 says, I blame Justice Alito for this. Chris and Ali and Pep and Juice say, that's a pointy agreement finger. Let's see. Lynn says, Roy's World is Rob Christopher's film and features the voice talents of Willem Dafoe, Lily Taylor, and Matt Dillon, as well as Barry. It's excellent. Seek it out.
He's reading people writing in.
Okay, and let's see. And then Chris and Ali and Pep also say, it's enjoyable as an adventure. Dairy Queen says, yes, please. Lynn says, we Berkeleyites are used to power outages.
Well, here's another poem that's a particular favorite of this friend of ours who we hope will still be able to join us. He's in Berlin, actually, but it's a favorite poem of his wife's who raises horses. The poem has nothing to do with horses. It's called The Arm. Can you hear me okay, Pete?
Yeah, you sound great. You look much better now.
Thank you. My friend Patrick has a friend whose right arm was pulled off by an orangutan. The guy's a terrible driver, Patrick says. Goes too fast. Insists on driving a car with a stick shift. Part of it is trying to prove that missing an arm is no impediment to his physical skills. He was an animal handler at a zoo. The orangutan loved him and one day wouldn't let go, fought to keep the arm till he was tranquilized and it was taken away. The arm could not be surgically reattached. When the orangutan saw the man again, he began jumping up and down and screeching, reaching for him through the bars of his cage. "Let him out," said the man. "He wants to embrace me." But the zookeeper would not and led the man away. Before this incident, Patrick told me, the orangutan was always happy to have visitors, cavorting around. He appears despondent, mostly sits and doesn't eat much. "What happened to the arm?" I asked. "My friend kept it," Patrick said, "preserved in a freezer. Every so often he takes out the arm and looks at it. But he stopped going to see the orangutan. He feels guilty," he says, "as if he has pulled off his own arm."
And so, and what's the basic like sort of time period over which the work's collected from?
In this book, probably only about 5 or 6 years, something like that, maybe a little longer, maybe 10 years. But then some older poems that I included in here that are no longer available to people, poems that I liked and thought deserved to be preserved in some way. And music also, still, as I explained in the beginning, how I began with the music, and it still belongs. I'll read another poem that's along those lines called "Big Words" from my friend Arthur Okazaki in New Orleans. I don't know if he's listening. His son, Miles Okazaki, is one of the great jazz guitarists in the world right now. His solo recordings of Thelonious Monk's tunes, all of his compositions, is a marvelous, honored now collection. Anyway, here's a poem called "Big Words." "What's my old friend Arthur Okazaki doing today in New Orleans? Here in San Francisco, it's a gloomy January day, clouds everywhere, even on the ground almost, like it used to be when I first got here nearly 50 years ago. Arthur sent me a photo, 2 photos pasted together titled Bomber, of a gas station and an airplane, one overlapping the other. Arthur's an artist, writer, and photographer who will live to be 100. He's almost there. Like his parents in Hawaii did. Arthur was born and grew up in Honolulu. He promised to take me there to visit Hotel Street, but we never went. Now probably too late. He's a great artist, a genius really, with a surprising sense of humor, who knows jazz, women, baseball, and how to make a great gin martini. What more to ask of a man? I forgot to say, he's also generous with money, time, and never gives advice, at least not to me, which is enough to qualify him as a sort of saint. A bow to you, Okazaki-san, on this rainy day and every other for so long as we still have them. I wish I had a better poem to send you, and that we two were sitting in your kitchen with martinis, listening to Jackie McLean or Sonny Stitt. Here there are goldfinches in the kumquat tree. When it rains, they hide behind the leaves. Black caps, white striped tails. Their songs remind me of Eric Dolphin straight ahead. 2 months ago in New York, after listening to George Mraz play his solo, I said to him, there was a lot of Dolphy in there. And he replied, those are big words, man. So it's there, it's in the music, that's what it is. It's all music to me.
Well, I was thinking earlier too of when we were talking about, you're learning music and writing poetry sort of intuitively and from experience. And I was thinking of a line in one of the poems about how you can't understand, or writing about music means nothing if you don't already know it. Do you remember that line?
Say that again.
It was something about like writing about music means nothing if you don't already know it. And that's sort of like intuition. When we were talking earlier, it made me think of that line, just about that, you know, learning by intuition, and sort of that there's certain things that maybe can't be explained.
Well, what that strikes with me is, you know, back in the day, to make some money, I was an original writer for Rolling Stone magazine, when Rolling Stone was really an important publication, and in all sorts of ways, both for music, for politics, for the culture in general. And this is going back, now I'm going back to like the very beginning of 1968. And, you know, people would wait in line to get the new Rolling Stone at midnight out wherever you could get it. And, you know, it's not what it became. It's no longer what it was, let's put it that way. In any event, but, you know, I was doing profiles of people with, since I was from Chicago, I knew a lot of these people. So I did articles and interviews with Howlin' Wolf and Buddy Guy. And I wrote a lot of record reviews, and it was great, but I was doing it for 25 or 50 bucks. It was that kind of thing. But I wrote that later. You have to know what the music is. It's like, I really don't like reading about music. I don't like, this is very personal, reading about people write about the music. I just want to listen to the music. It's just not the same thing. And I used to write and say this, when you're writing about a person, if you're doing a profile of Howlin' Wolf, say, you know, well, Wolf was such a character, it was easy to write about him. And I remember, I'll just say one little tidbit. I remember he was appearing at the old Carousel Ballroom in San Francisco. It was just like the Fillmore. It was, and there was all kinds of chaos going on, and he didn't really have a dressing room. It was just a little table. And Wolf was, you know, typical, like he always was, with a, you know, like a burlap shirt and, you know, a half pint of Old Crow in his back pocket, and big red handkerchief sticking out. And he was kind of a tough guy, you know, a certain way to talk to, but for some reason I got along with him, and I used to go see him, you know, in Chicago on the West Side at this place he liked to play, which later burned down. In any case, he looked at me, and Janis Joplin was there, and all these people kind of running ragged, and everybody's on drugs. And he turned to me and he said, "Man, what are you and I doing here?" It was, and it made sense. So it got us off on the right foot. And I think that's what I also tried to do with the poems, is get that kind of off the street stuff. And I don't know if that makes sense to anybody out there. If you have something to say about it, you ought to write in or phone in, or how that works. I'm going to read another poem that I like. It's called Afterlife. In the dream, my dear friend Tita Sorcia, whom I had been told 3 years ago had died in Mexico City, was revealed to still be alive in a remote mountain village in the state of Veracruz, residing among Totonac Indians who are distant relatives. "What is she doing there?" I asked the person who called to tell me this news. "Weaving baskets with other women of the village to sell to tourists," he said. "Why would she want people to think she was dead?" I asked. "Who can know?" he answered. "Didn't you ever wish to disappear without warning, to become invisible, to leave everyone and everything in the present behind?" When I woke up, I pictured Tita as I knew her, lovely as ever, well-dressed, sitting at the bar of a trendy restaurant in Roma Norte, sipping a martini, talking, and laughing softly in her shy way, showing her very white teeth, long black hair unfurled to her shoulders. She's made it easy on herself, I thought. having already entered her afterlife without explanation or having to die to get there. That's the kind of poem you write when you get into your 70s.
And how does the, working in so many different forms, how do you move between them? Are you working on poems and writing stories and sort of books and scripts all at the same time? Or do you sort of go through periods of focusing on one form versus another?
That's a really good question, Michael, because the thing is, as far as I'm concerned, I have to put myself in a totally different framework, a frame of reference. Writing poetry, Al Young used to tell me, well, he writes his poems, then he throws them in a big box and he goes on to whatever lengthier project a different kind of project that he's working on. I'm not exactly that way, but in order to write poetry, for me now, it even sounds pretentious to me to talk that way. Because I'm such a non-academic. They didn't like me in school and I didn't like them, so we didn't go together. So I'm basically an autodidact, I learn by listening, whether it's music, whether it's writing, just whatever it happens to be, by looking when it comes to art, that kind of thing. No, I have to just put everything out of my mind. Writing screenplays, for example, is using an entirely different language. It's an entirely different language, It's not like writing fiction. It's not like writing poetry. It's not like writing music. It's like nothing else. It's like itself. So, I have to be seeing it. So, I got into screenwriting, I don't know, in my 40s. And I had to learn how to do it. I'd never read a screenplay, but I just had to imagine what I was seeing on the screen. What were people saying to one another? And then how to tell a story. So how do you tell a story in a screenplay? Well, Francis Coppola, who went to film school at UCLA, and he said, well, you got to have the 3 acts, and that's how you have to do it. I understood what Francis was telling me, but when I was working with him, but it wasn't quite the same with me. I'm a visual writer. I like to think that way. I like to think in visual terms. So that's the only way that I can really explain it. Here's another one. Passage on a Slow Freighter. Blaise Cendrars wrote, "Today I am perhaps the happiest man in the world. I have everything I don't want." When I was younger, I could not have understood this feeling. Now, 3 years shy of 70, it makes sense. A sentiment I share, having shed the pride of both possessiveness and, worse, false necessity. No longer important to fool myself or believe my own lies. It's the sparrow on the windowsill on a darkening afternoon. That we both can smell the fast approaching rain is all the belonging I need. That sounds like a poem.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that I could see the sparrow somehow, which, was something that happened. How the sparrow found its way into the poem. Well, it appeared naturally. There it was. So it belonged. It was part of the time. It was part of the moment. So I think also, I don't know how people who teach poetry talk about it, but it was capturing the moment, I guess. And that's all I can say about it.
And you were saying earlier that you feel like writing poetry feeds into your fiction in making it sort of more efficient. What do you feel like it feeds into, like, does sort of the visual the visual sort of language of poetry feed into your screenwriting or vice versa? Like how do the forms, do you feel like one kind of betters the other?
No, as I was saying, and I don't know if this was before we got cut off or not, but it was basically to learn the economy of language, to keep it to the minimum. And, it's just as important what you leave out. In fact, maybe more important, what you leave out than what you include. And so that's what it meant to me in terms of writing a sentence, putting a paragraph together, whatever it is. So, I'm sure there are other writers who work like this, but basically, Jack Kerouac used to say, well, he'd write when he was ready to write. And then whatever he wrote, it was, trust me, it was not stream of consciousness. That's a whole different school of thought, and people misrepresent stream of consciousness all the time. Joyce meant it as an effect. It didn't mean that he was writing down anything that came into his head. He edited quite carefully, and so did Jack Kerouac. So, but Kerouac's idea was to let everything in, whatever, came in the window, that kind of thing. And then to write it. And so it was ever, again, I'm going back to what's ever in the moment. And so that he felt that he could get to that place to whatever he was thinking about, that was it. Then everything was already edited. It was already ready to publish. He wasn't always correct, in terms of what was best, but sometimes he was. You read the Subterraneans, the beginning part of his novel, The Subterraneans. Man, that's just like a riff. He was thinking musically. So it was the music that he wanted to hit. He wanted to hit all the right notes. That was the point. And so I guess it all circles around. It's the same thing with me, as I was speaking earlier, and going back to the music. What do you leave in? What do you leave out? Not only big words, but big choices.
And I feel like in this book, there's so many, I don't know, there's like a warmth. There's so many memories or poems that feel like memories. Can you say anything about sort of how you came to read poetry, sort of like what brought you to it, and sort of whom were you reading in the beginning?
When I was a junior in high school in Chicago, my teacher was Mayor Daley's daughter, Patricia Daley, who had been in a nunnery. And for whatever reason, she left the nunnery. And anyway, she was my high school English teacher. And so she was teaching us poetry. Well, nobody in there was interested. It was like a scene out of Blackboard Jungle. I kid you not. It was really funny, But in any case, she assigned a poem. And I forget now exactly what it was, but it was some old boring poem. And, we were supposed to read it and then explain what the writer was saying using poetry. And we had no idea about form, meter, breath, anything like that. I mean, trying to teach, it was like trying to teach a bunch of apes and the girls who were trying to avoid the apes. So if you can imagine that kind of scenario. She called on me to explain the poem. Maybe it was something by Robert Browning. I can't recall. And I got up and I made my anti-poetry speech. I says, who the hell needs poetry? What is poetry how is that gonna benefit anybody's life? That kind of thing. So, so that was my participation in the class. I'm sure I didn't pass the class. But in any event, or if I did, it was just because she liked me for some reason. She said I reminded her of one of her brothers. I don't know if it was the brother Richard Daley Jr., who later became mayor. But anyway, that was the only poetry class
more or less. It wasn't a poetry class per se. It was just, where I heard anybody talk about poetry. But does anything that I'm saying make sense to anybody out there? I need some feedback, from Peter or for some.
Yeah.
Oh, in big ways, in very big ways. Yeah. And there's something about like, the story collection and the poetry collection that they kind of feed off of each other in very interesting ways. I mean, I like going from one to the other, and there are different speeds, and they're kind of like almost in sort of different dimensions, but a lot of what you're saying, it does resonate very much. I think we got some comments too. Dominic says, makes perfect sense. Well, Christopher has a statement, Howlin' Wolf is perfect driving music, but that came earlier on. Here we go. Musicality of language in fiction and poetry, says Dominic again. So
What was the driving comment again?
Howlin' Wolf is good driving music.
Oh, Howlin' Wolf is good driving music. Well, Mary Lou reminded the other day, now we're at an age where we're losing people, right and left. And I was thinking in particular about a couple of people who had died. It was their birthday on the 8th of May. And I made some comment about, how I wish I could talk to so-and-so on this particular day, but he was unavailable, forever unavailable. And she reminded me of what the poet Lou Welch, whom I knew slightly, said. He said, well, you talk to the dead while you're driving. So Dominic or whoever wrote that in, that's, I'm just, throwing that in.
yeah.
If it makes sense to you. And I thought of another poem.
Yeah.
In a past life, I was mistakenly a poet. When we lived in the mountains, my thoughts were simple compared to those to come. Almost 50 years have passed. Hair white, friends gone. More often alone, I forget the time between then and now. Is it necessary to recapture the past? My only question. Autumn begins. I felt it yesterday morning hiking by the bay. On my way back to the mountains, the wind's no longer against me. Should I be surprised? So every once in a while, I get it, every once in a while, the thought occurs to me, I think I ought to quit writing poetry or trying to write poems, because it's not the same. It's not the same anymore. I think in a funny way with this form, it's almost too personal, I always felt that the poems were where you're giving something away, and you have to be in that frame of mind where you're willing to give it away. And they're like letters. They're really just letters, and people have often called and used in their titles, letters, or like Jim Harrison wrote Letters to Yesemin, which are his greatest poems, I think. And it makes perfect sense. They're letters. Here's one that really follows along in that sense. Early October, remembering my friend Toru Takamitsu. I keep in my apricot chest the willow branch you gave me the morning we parted at Peach Blossom Spring. Brittle now, I handle it tenderly. How can it be you are no longer there to dangle your fingers in the bright green water? Well, I was honored when Toru Takamitsu, for those of you who may not know, was a great classical composer, an autodidact, in fact, became a great friend of mine. And he came to me and asked me to write the libretto for his first opera. So I thought, why did Takemitsu, who I was familiar with only from his many scores he did for soundtracks of movies, for Teshigahara, for Kurosawa, he wrote many scores for Kurosawa's movies, but that Takemitsu should single me out and seek me out to write the libretto, which I'd never written a libretto before. It was kind of an amazing circumstance. And anyway, we got along great. We had a great time. Takemitsu died before he could complete his opera, and it was completed by his disciple, Ichiro no Daira. It's called Madrugada. And I did write it, and went on to write a couple of more libretti for composers, Olga Neuwirth, the most prominent among them. And she also did an opera based on the film David Lynch and I wrote, Lost Highway, which was the beginning of that. And I thought that Takemitsu had come to me because, he knew of me through Wild at Heart, or, the more well-known works. And I asked him that question, and he said, no, it was for your poetry. I said, my poetry? He says, oh yeah, I'm a poet too. And he says, I published my own books, and he gave me one. He said, but I read your poetry. I said, in Japanese? He said, no, in English. But it was the poems that made me think that you could give me what I needed in my opera. So anyway, after Takemitsu died, Sony, who was his record company, compiled all of Takemitsu's recorded work. And they asked me to contribute to it, to write a piece about Takemitsu, to write a little remembrance or something like that, among other people, I guess. And what I wrote was this poem. And when we received the big package of Takemitsu's music, there at the beginning of the whole collection was my poem. It actually chokes me up a little to think about that. I was so shocked. I was so surprised that they thought enough of it, and that, it had some impact even on the afterlife, as far as Toru-san was concerned. And it's the greatest honor I ever received as a writer.
So we've got some questions coming through the pike here. So Jay Charles says, interesting comments about Kerouac. I think his earlier work, The Town and the City and The Sea is My Brother, is well worth reading, as well as his more well-known novels that more reflect the techniques Barry was referring to. Did I cut out? Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're
cutting
at
out.
least for us.
Want me to repeat that one more time? Or the last
Try
part?
again.
Yeah, so they're referring to The Town and the City and The Sea is My Brother by Kerouac, more than his more well-known novels, as reflecting the techniques that Barry is referring to. Wow, you guys still there? Can you hear me?
Breaking up a little. Am I coming through okay now?
Yeah, you're coming through okay. Sorry about the technical thing.
No, that's all right.
Yeah, let's try another one. Can you hear me now?
We have to fight. Yeah.
Now you're breaking up.
Oh no.
God, man.
Well,
tonight has just been crazy. Okay.
2022.
Yeah.
22.
That's
Yeah.
the problem.
Look at what all the advances in technology
exactly.
have done for us.
We're talking to the phone.
Completely fucked up.
No
So,
kidding.
Can you hear
kidding.
me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Can you hear me okay?
There. You
All
can
right,
hear us, I think.
So the thing is that, Kerouac started in a very traditional way. I mean, using Thomas Wolfe as a model and Dreiser as a model and that kind of thing. So then when he wrote his first novel, The Town and the City, over several years, he was writing in that mode. It wasn't until later, as he explained ad nauseum, picking up off his friend Neil Cassidy, that he figured out a new way of writing, a spontaneous bop prosody or whatever he chose to call it at the time, but looking for his own voice and certainly being heavily influenced by Joyce. So in The Town and the City, which is a beautiful novel, I remember Aileen Lee, who was the model for the character Mardu Fox in Kerouac's novel, The Subterraneans, said to me about The Town and the City, she said, that's my favorite of Jack's books, which is one reason why when Larry Lee and I did the oral biography of Jack Kerouac back in the 70s, I titled it Jack's Book. So that really, I took it from what Aileen had said to me. And so he started off in a traditional way, imitating people. That's, he was a student of literature at Columbia, but he found his own voice. And I think that's the thing we're talking about here, Pete. The thing is to find your own voice. And how many people want to listen to it? How many people pick up on what you're writing, what you're saying, who have common concerns, that kind of thing? You never know. So you might as well do what the fuck you want, Well, I don't know if we lost you.
I think I just lost your video.
I know there's all kinds of stuff coming by on this
Oh,
cell.
man. What a night. Can you hear me okay, though?
Yes.
Okay, well, let's just continue without the video. Well, okay, whatever.
Oh, we got you.
We're good.
So Dominic asks or says, speaking of loss of the underworld, I think of your work as inhabiting that world, a kind of communication with the dead, which is what all my favorite work does, no matter genre.
I'm sorry, now you're breaking up really badly
Okay.
and we can't hear you.
So I think Dominic was saying that your writing reminds him of the underworld when you speak of loss, and that your work inhabits that world, and it's a communication with the dead. Uh-oh, here we go again. Okay, let me see if I can get your audio back up. Oh, man.
Yeah,
I think we're being haunted.
We're there.
I think we're being haunted tonight.
I know. That way.
By the 222.
Power is still off here.
Yeah, the power's still
Michael's house.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
So I thought this
Sorry.
was the ideal place to do it. Well, thank you. I'm reading some of the comments that are coming through on here, which I really appreciate. Thanks. Why decisions? I couldn't get the whole thing on that question. Can you get them, Peter?
Yeah. Why decisions did you make when ordering the poems? Why the title aside from the poem?
Well, at first, I think I had a different title for the book. And then my publisher, Dan Simon, he really liked that title, How Chet Baker Died. He thought it was hip or something. I don't know. Here, I'll read it. I can't really answer. The order of the poems is basically most often in the order I wrote them. I don't go to any particular lengths except at the end, really. I think I reordered some poems. I thought these poems would be better off ending the collection. But mostly, and it's just like the Roy stories, Pete, in Roy's World or whatever, they're mostly, it's the structure is elliptical. It doesn't follow any chronological system in any way. Sometimes I'll move something around, but really that's seldom. And they're mainly in the order that I write them and that, they come to me. How Chet Baker Died. I saw Chet Baker in the early 1970s at Strikers, a small jazz club off Amsterdam Avenue on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, in the middle of a harsh winter. I walked over from where I was staying on 85th and Riverside Drive, weekday night, heavy wind and snow. I'm sorry, braving wind and snow, curious to hear what he sounded like a few years after he'd had his front teeth knocked out by drug dealers in San Francisco. I knew he'd been living in Italy where he'd been in jail, but become a living legend. Miles Davis hated him famously because of his good looks, now gone, and popularity, despite his rudimentary technique. There were perhaps 12 people in the club, including myself. Chet Baker came on stage wearing a brown sport coat, no tie, blue slacks, slicked back hair, caved in cheeks, put trumpet to lips and blew. There it was, that flat, sweet tone, but without sustaining notes the way he had before losing his own teeth. I'd forgotten the sidemen, piano, bass, and drums, or any tunes other than The Touch of Your Lips, Traveling Light, and These Foolish Things. I went back the next night, and there were about 35 people in the audience. Baker was wearing the same clothes. He didn't say much. I left after the second set. He died not too long after. Fell out of a window in Amsterdam. Maybe he was pushed, a junkie's demise. I remember the weather better than I do his performances. Ernest Hemingway's advice to young writers was to not forget the weather, and I haven't.
It's beautiful.
Thank you, Barry.
Anyway, Dan liked that, so that's why it's the title, to answer that question. I like it now too.
So Charles says, I like jazz references in your poems. E-Ritter says, the last two poems in the collection are beautiful. Thank you. Christopher says, how do you know when a poem is finished? And then Susan says, this was wonderful, authentic, passionate, and full of history. And I think I just
So it
lost.
worked, right? Gee, it worked.
Fuck
you
the
hear me?
technology. I really hate it. I can't wait until.
You know, we just need to go down to the corner bar. We should all meet at the corner bar in about an hour. We should pick a bar. We should all go there. Make sure that, well, those of you who are from somewhere else, I'll bring a little recording device and I'll record us, and we can all have a bunch of drinks and just sit around a table and then just do this again. But
Well, what was that one that was up there? It said, I think it was from someone named Amy that said, how to use something with my own poem. It was an interesting question, but
yeah, it says how much you take to your own poem is the question Amy asks.
I don't know what
much, but it's kind of a weird question, but it's also kind of strangely compelling.
Amy, can you rewrite that? Can you rewrite that question? How much do I take of what? I don't understand it. Anyway, but it's probably the technology that's.
Maybe it's, I mean, like how autobiographical, like how much of yourself do you put into
Okay,
your own
so here's
poems?
a question. Here's an answer to that question about how do you know when the poem is finished? How much time do you take? I'll get back to you. Thank you. So here's a poem, Rough Mix for Miles Okazaki, who I explained earlier is a great jazz guitarist. More and more, I listen to Monk. Functional, of course, takes your mind down the river in a canoe that doesn't quite tip over. Then the almost 22-minute version of Round Midnight, not letting up before Monk's mood, demands your attention for the rest of the afternoon. Writing about music makes no sense unless you already know it.
That was it, yeah.
In Monk's case, there's no denouement, only one rentrée after another. Begin again and hold that thought until you don't need to. So there's your answer.
That's a good one.
I
That's
kind of feel like
That's when the poem ends.
That's
So
when
I
it's
answered
done.
it with my own poem. So thank you, Barry.
I feel like we're in a Bardo state tonight.
Yeah.
Like maybe we all died and we're kind of in this kind of strange electronic limbo, and we have to kind of like find a way to sabotage it somehow. And I
Well,
think
listen, Michael's getting to a low battery on his
My
phone
wife's phone.
or his wife's phone, wherever we're on now. We're on the second iPhone, and
Right.
including
I'm
not
sorry.
including the computer. So I think we ought to call
We
it.
should
night.
probably
we
call it a
persevere.
night. Yeah,
We
yeah. Let's
to you all, and maybe we schedule some time.
Yeah.
And
In person.
so all I can say is, I guess, get the book, How Chet Baker Died, and you'll have all the answers.
It's
We
a good
posted-
sell.
And Peter, thank you, man.
Oh man, always a pleasure, always fun. So a delight. Thank you both. Michael, happy birthday. Everybody in the audience, thank you for joining us.